presenting Shakespeare's Imaginary Life. There is something wrong with their attribution. These scholars believe that the man whose alleged portrait is in the lower right-hand corner of the screen wrote the most celebrated plays in Western literature. The main question in this case is the biographical evidence relevant, probative, distinct, strong, sharp, and well-defined enough to lead us to conclude the Stratford man had a writing career? As we saw in the videos, what evidence do Stratfordians really have? Stratford and London evidence. This is what they have. 7 points from London evidence and 8 points in the Stratford evidence. But what do they really have? Incomplete circumstantial evidence. That's why I say there are only imaginary biographies of the man from Stratford. All are full of qualifying words which are needed to fill in gaps. We know that he probably did, he must have, probably he, it would appear, maybe, we cannot doubt, we can assume that he may have, though we have no evidence, it is obvious that he could have. All of this requires the logical fallacy of arguing from ignorance. They are filling in the gaps because they have no evidence for what they're saying. This was the situation in 1923, 101 years ago, in Joseph Quincy Adams' A Life of William Shakespeare, published by Constable and Company Limited. This is from the introduction. This stagnation in discovery of more information is perhaps responsible for the tendency, especially marked in the last decade, for writers to deal in fanciful speculation, evolving from slight evidence or none worthy of the name, bizarre and often elaborately detailed hypotheses regarding Shakespeare's relations with his contemporaries. But the results of such ingenuity are likely to be as perilous as they are unsubstantial, and for the most part must be ignored by the biographer. Yet here is the biographer doing exactly what he claimed he would not do. This is from page 33. It is not difficult for us to imagine, the boy. We know he had auburn hair, large hazel eyes, ruddy cheeks, and a high forehead and a gentle disposition. Perhaps this last quality came to him from his mother. May we not safely add that her son's poetry breathed of her? For it surely was. Here is more of the same later on, the next page. The genial relations that must have existed between him, John Shakespeare, and his little son. We may suppose that William was required to take care of for the smaller children, and this perhaps constituted his earliest training. And more of the same. On special occasions he must have, sometimes too he must have visited. In this quiet country town, the young William probably, we can imagine him, in the river too he could discover. Here is Adams quoting Furnivall's biography of Shakespeare. Taking the boy to be the father of the man, I see, read imagine, a square-built yet lithe and active fellow with ruddy cheeks, hazel eyes, a high forehead, and auburn hair, a favorite wherever he goes. Isn't this just shameless plagiarism? He continues on, and these are just selections for the next 8 pages. And we cannot doubt that. We may be sure that, but perhaps the place that, surely all these places would make the youthful Shakespeare. He must have rejoiced. He must have. It cannot be doubted. Possibly Shakespeare was. Not for a moment can it be doubted. He may have witnessed. Here is how he ends his chapter on the boyhood. We have no evidence, however, that at this early stage he was a voluminous reader. Probably he found his chief pleasure in outdoor sports. Probably he was working for his father since the age of 13. Probably he never went to school. We don't know. Probably he was bullying other kids. Probably he was digging ditches. We don't know. Then he begins chapter 5, the apprenticeship and marriage, with this. The previous few chapters were all about his relations and his ancestry, which are pretty well documented, but they still contain a bit of speculation. But here he continues on. It is generally asserted, but of this there is no proof. Upon finishing his schooling he was probably, in the case of Shakespeare the latter course was doubtless followed. Beyond this it is hardly safe to conjecture, although we must take cognizance of the several traditions, late and more or less untrustworthy, which have come down to us. How can he use more or less untrustworthy traditions in a book purportedly to be of factual information? It looks like to me that Adams was filling in pages to pad out his book to justify the publisher publishing his biography. So which came first? We have two paragraphs here. I'll read them in order. Of the early life of the young Shakespeare, little authentic information can be gleaned. Like other youths of his village, he attended the free grammar school, where he would have learned, and doubtless did learn, Latin and some Greek, a little English too, but probably not much. Although no attendance records for the period survive, most biographers agree that Shakespeare was probably educated at the King's New School in Stratford, a free school chartered in 1553, about a quarter-mile from his home. Grammar schools varied in quality during the Elizabethan era, but grammar school curricula were largely similar. The basic Latin text was standardized by royal decree, and the school would have provided an intensive education in grammar based upon Latin classical authors. So which came first, one or two? The first excerpt comes from A Sketch of Shakespeare, published 1879. The other one is from Wikipedia, which was accessed in the fall of 2023. Was anything new learned in 144 years? Apparently not. Furthermore, what would a rural country boy need Greek for? Do you really think that in grammar schools they would read Latin classical authors? Possibly, but that's highly doubtful. Mark Twain and Professor Osborne of the Natural History Museum in Washington built the skeleton of a, quote, brontosaurus, now known as a patasaurus. And this is how they did it, according to Twain. We had 9 bones, and we built the rest of him out of plaster of Paris. Or we'd have built a brontosaur who could sit down beside the Stratford Shakespeare, and none but an expert could tell which was the biggest or contained more plaster. He, Shakespeare, is a brontosaur. 9 bones and 600 barrels of plaster of Paris. This is how Twain assessed how the Shakespeareans, the Stratfordians, think. The Shakespearite conducts his assuming upon a definite principle, an unchanging and immutable law, which is 2 and 8 and 7 and 14 added together make 165. We can scramble these books up and nobody would be able to tell which book any part came from. The books date from the 18th century straight through to the 21st century. While he was alive, nobody wrote of his personality or his life or claimed they knew he was a writer. All evidence Stratfordian scholars have about the man as a writer is either posthumous or cryptic. This probably sums up what there is of a life of Shakespeare. This is William Leahy, The Dreamscape of Nostalgia, Shakespearean Biography. Too much information, but not about Shakespeare. Published in the Journal of Early Modern Studies, number 5 from 2016. In Shakespearean biographical writing, we are presented with a Shakespeare who is not real, but it would seem we believe what we see. The subgenre of Shakespearean biography is therefore, I suggest, characterized by the constant reiteration of fictional forms and what could be regarded as simulations. In other words, the life is a lie. Here is a quick quiz. When were these words printed about Shakespeare's lost years? Of Shakespeare's actual occupation during these important years, 1572 to 1586, when his character was formed, there is not a scintilla of contemporary proof, and the vague traditionary evidence which has been resorted to was picked up many years after his death, when the object was to startle the world with things strange and supernatural about him. Was it A, 1959, B, 1859, C, 1909, or D, 2009? The answer is B, in 1859. It's found in Lord Campbell's book, Shakespeare's Legal Acquirements Considered. It's available on the Internet Archive, and if anybody wants to hear, or read rather, what a legal expert had to say about the legal terms in Shakespeare, this is one of the best sources you can get. In more than 160 years, we know just as little as Lord Campbell. Here's J.M. Presley. One of the biggest mysteries about William Shakespeare, however, is that he completely disappears for more than 7 years. When he was 21 years old, 1585, Shakespeare was married with 3 children and living in the small town of Stratford in England. 7 years later, 1592, he was living in London as a resident playwright and part owner of a theatre company. Nobody knows just what Shakespeare was doing for all those years in between. What he said about living in London as resident playwright and part owner of a theatre company is pure speculation because there is no evidence whatsoever for it. These are just some of the occupations he is thought to have had by Stratfordians: doctor, law clerk, lawyer, schoolmaster, scrivener, and a scrivener is someone who takes dictation, clerk aboard a ship, merchant, sailor, soldier, grain dealer, moneylender, malt dealer, butcher, glover, and finally, holder of horses for nobles who visited theaters. These required an advanced education. The doctor, lawyer, law clerk, schoolmaster, scrivener, and clerk aboard a ship. Yet there is no evidence whatsoever of Shakespeare ever attending the Inns of Court, whether it be the Middle Temple, the Inner Temple, or Gray's Inn, or either of the universities, Oxford or Cambridge. It's possible that he could have been a doctor, because there were no requirements for being a doctor other than knowing a few home spells and things like that. But again, they required advanced education. These two, being a sailor or a soldier, would have left behind some record of enlistment, possibly for soldier, definitely for sailor, since they needed ship's manifests to be filled out. How many sailors you got? Who are they? These are the only plausible careers he could have had, given that there's no record of him having no advanced education. Grain dealer, merchant, moneylender, malt dealer, butcher, and glover. These are the only careers we know he had, given the documentary evidence. Malt dealer, investor, and moneylender. And this one is just ludicrous. Holder of horses for nobles who visited theaters, and this is how he learned all about court life, falconry, and other great subjects that are in the plays and poems. Here is the origins of that story. My comments are in yellow. Sir William Davenant told Mr. Betterton, who communicated it to Mr. Rowe, yet Rowe does not mention it in his life of the poet. Rowe told it to Mr. Pope, yet Pope fails to mention it in his life of the poet. And Mr. Pope told it to Dr. Newton, the late editor of Milton, and from a gentleman who heard it from him, 'tis here related. This is quoted in Adams in 1923, but it's taken directly from Robert Shields' The Lives of the Poets, published 170 years prior in 1753. How can we take this as evidence of a life story? We can conclude by all of this that there are only imaginary biographies of the man from Stratford. Thanks for watching. Stay safe.